Good evening from NASA's Kennedy Space Center in Florida. You're looking at a live view of Space Launch Complex 40, where SpaceX is counting down to a launch opportunity tonight for the Starlink 4-34 mission. This liftoff time is set for 8:18 p.m. and 40 seconds Eastern Time. That is 12:18 and 40 seconds a.m. UTC. SpaceX's Falcon 9 rocket is currently vertical at Pad 40, now an hour and 14 minutes or so from tonight's launch opportunity. This mission has been delayed 5 days now. This is the sixth launch attempt that SpaceX has mounted for this mission. Bad weather kept the Falcon 9 rocket on the ground for nearly all of last week. And last night, weather was again poor. And SpaceX called off the countdown yesterday before the start of propellant loading. They actually lowered the Falcon 9 horizontal for a few hours this morning. We haven't got an explanation from SpaceX on why that was the case, but perhaps a part of the launch vehicle or the ground support equipment needed some servicing or inspections. But the Falcon 9 was lifted vertical once again this morning, about 10 hours ago or so, in preparation for the launch tonight. The weather conditions here locally on Florida's Space Coast are much improved from this time all last week. It's just past the 7 p.m. mark here in Florida, Eastern Time, and there are some scattered clouds overhead the Space Coast right now, but there is no thunderstorm activity in the immediate vicinity, no rainfall, and weather right now looks favorable for launch. We hope that holds and remains the case for an hour and 13 minutes from now.
Now inside of 64 minutes, hour and 4 minutes away from launch tonight. As you can see, it's a very beautiful evening here at Cape Canaveral. You're continuing to look live at Space Launch Complex 40, where the 229-foot tall or 70-meter Falcon 9 is now less than 30 minutes from the start of propellant loading. About an hour and 3 minutes left until tonight's launch time of 8:18 p.m. Eastern Time, 12:18 a.m. UTC. You're looking now live at a view here at Kennedy Space Center showing the arrival of some liquid nitrogen tanks that will be used to support SpaceX's next generation Starship and Super Heavy launch vehicle. These nitrogen tanks, we believe, originated from Brownsville, Texas, near the SpaceX Starbase facility, where the Starship is being readied for its first orbital flight test. SpaceX is building a second Starship orbital launch site here at the Kennedy Space Center, out at Launch Complex 39A. SpaceX recently lifted the final segment of the launch tower for the Starship. However, a significant amount of work remains to be completed at Pad 39A to prepare for the first Starship Super Heavy launch from here in Florida. One of the elements of the launch pad will be these liquid nitrogen tanks, that have just arrived here at Kennedy Space Center by barge. We expect these to be taken either to the launch pad or to another site here at Kennedy Space Center, where they'll be staged and readied for installation to support future Super Heavy and Starship launch operations. Liquid nitrogen is one of several propellants, or not propellants, but fluids used to support most rocket launches. The Starship and Super Heavy vehicles themselves will be fueled by methane and liquid oxygen. Liquid nitrogen is used in some purging and other functions during Starship and Super Heavy launch preparations. And these 4 cylindrical tanks, again, have just arrived today at the dock here at Kennedy Space Center. Now, an hour and 1 minute away from tonight's launch opportunity. Again, liftoff is scheduled for 8:18 p.m. Eastern Time, or 12:18 a.m. UTC. Now, inside of 1 hour until tonight's launch, 58 minutes, 50 seconds remaining in the countdown this evening. Again, the weather conditions here at Cape Canaveral look much more favorable for launch of the Falcon 9 rocket tonight. There are 54 Starlink internet satellites on board tonight's mission. SpaceX's countdown is approaching T-minus 53 minutes. Liftoff remains set for 8:18 p.m. Eastern Time, 12:18 a.m. UTC. The sun has set or is setting here on Florida's Space Coast. You're starting to see the flashing hazard lights on the 4 lightning towers become more visible now as we enter blue hour here in Central Florida. These 4 lightning towers on each side of the Falcon 9 are there to protect the vehicle while it's vertical on the launch pad from lightning strikes. They're connected with a series of catenary wires, and these lightning towers were originally built for the Air Force's Titan rocket program. The Titan rocket was the vehicle that previously launched from Pad 40. The last Titan 4 launched from this pad in 2005, and the pad was handed over to SpaceX a few years later, and the first Falcon 9 rocket took off from this launch pad back on June the 4th of 2010. Tonight's flight will mark the 176th launch of a Falcon 9 rocket over the last 12 years. It's also the 42nd Falcon 9 launch just in this year. SpaceX is on a pace to launch more than once per week on average this year. The company is currently targeting just a tad over 60 launches in 2022. Tonight, again, is number 42 of the year. T-minus 45 minutes. We're about 10 minutes away from the expected start of propellant loading on board the Falcon 9 rocket. This will involve flowing about 1 million pounds of kerosene and liquid oxygen propellants into the vehicle. Again, that propellant loading is expected to begin at T-minus 35 minutes, less than 10 minutes from now. We're now 45 minutes away from tonight's launch opportunity, which is set for 8:18 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, 12:18 a.m. UTC. It is a beautiful evening here at Kennedy Space Center, in stark contrast to the previous 5 evenings when we've had rainfall, lightning, thunder, and thick cloud cover over the spaceport tonight. There are a few scattered high-level clouds, and there are some thunder showers well offshore tonight, but nothing in the immediate area around the launch pad. So we do expect weather to be favorable for launch this evening, unless something dramatically changes in the next 44 minutes. If you're just joining us, I'm Stephen Clark, editor of Spaceflight Now, reporting live from Kennedy Space Center tonight. You're looking at a live view of Space Launch Complex 40 in beautiful blue hour light here on Florida Space Coast. We're about 4 miles away from the launch pad here at our position. This mission is designated Starlink 4-34, and on board the Falcon 9 tonight are 54 Starlink internet satellites. These satellites are heading to orbit to join SpaceX's Starlink network, providing high-speed, low-latency broadband connectivity around the world. If you haven't had a chance to do so yet, please hit the like button on our stream. Please hit the like button because that helps us gain a larger audience for our coverage. If you're enjoying our coverage and think others should also be watching, please hit the like button. We really appreciate that. SpaceX's countdown is now inside of T-minus 35 minutes. At T-minus 35 minutes, we expected to hear the call from SpaceX Launch Control that the propellants on the Falcon were now being loaded into the Falcon 9 rocket, but we haven't heard that yet. SpaceX's audio stream from their Launch Control Center is not currently up, so we're not able to listen in live and bring that to you. But propellant loading should have begun less than a minute ago at T-minus 35 minutes. We'll confirm that when we can. T-minus 32 minutes and 38 seconds. SpaceX's launch control audio stream is now active, and we should be bringing that to you live on this feed as well. We haven't heard anything yet from launch control, but we do expect to hear some chatter in the next few minutes as the Falcon 9 counts down to liftoff at 8:18 p.m. Eastern Time, or 12:18 a.m. UTC. T-minus 30 minutes and 37 seconds. We are now seeing a ring of frost forming on the outer skin of the Falcon 9's first stage. This condensation and frost that's building up on the first stage is indicative of propellant loading. Liquid oxygen is flowing into the Falcon 9 at this time. We can see that visually. This liquid oxygen is chilled down to several hundred degrees below zero. The liquid oxygen tank on the first stage is comprising roughly the upper 2/3 of that first stage booster, and kerosene is now being pumped into the kerosene tank on stage 1. That tank is just below the liquid oxygen tank at the bottom of the first stage, and then at the very base of the rocket there are 9 Merlin 1D engines. Now T-minus 27 minutes and 38 seconds. Again, tonight's mission is to deliver 54 more Starlink internet satellites into orbit. Tonight's launch will push the total number of Starlinks launched to 3,347. Roughly 3,000 of those satellites are currently in space, either providing broadband service or maneuvering into their operational positions in the network. This is what a stack of Starlink satellites looks like in launch configuration. This picture comes from SpaceX. It's from a previous Starlink launch. But the picture shows what the Starlinks look like stacked inside the payload fairing of the Falcon 9 rocket tonight. In this view, you can see the stack of Starlink spacecraft being prepared for encapsulation, with one half of the payload fairing moving into position to enclose the satellites for launch. The satellites are held down onto a payload attach fitting, which is then bolted to the second stage of the Falcon 9 rocket. There are 4 retention rods that actually keep the Starlink satellites firmly onto the vehicle during launch preparations and the climb into space. And once at the proper altitude and at the proper inclination, the command will be given from the rocket to jettison those retention rods, and at that point, the Starlink satellites will actually fly free of the Falcon 9 upper stage. The satellites will separate from one another through differential drag, and then they'll deploy solar panels and begin their post-launch testing before entering the constellation to provide internet service. Again, there are 54 Starlink satellites on board tonight's mission. Each of these weighs nearly 300 kilograms, about 660 pounds or so. They are solar powered, and they each have krypton-fueled ion propulsion systems that use a mixture of electricity and krypton gas for impulses to maneuver in orbit. The satellites are built at SpaceX's Starlink assembly line factory in Redmond, Washington, near Seattle. And tonight's mission is targeting what's known as shell number 4 of the Starlink network. So there are 5 shells in the Starlink network. Each of these is at a slightly different altitude and at a different inclination. Some are in polar orbit, some are in what's known as a mid-inclination orbit. Tonight's mission will target a mid-inclination orbit at 52.2 degrees inclination to the equator at an altitude of 335 miles or 540 kilometers. The satellites on board tonight's mission will be dropped off in a slightly lower orbit and then use their onboard propulsion to maneuver up to the operational altitude of 335 miles. For those of you not familiar with the Starlink program, the Starlink network, here's what a ground user terminal looks like. If you sign up for the service, you can receive this Starlink user terminal. It comes with a modem, and then you pay a monthly fee to connect to the Starlink network. This square-shaped phased array antenna automatically connects to the Starlink satellites as they fly overhead in low Earth orbit. We're taking a view of Pad 40 full screen once again inside of 25 minutes until tonight's launch. Weather continues to look favorable. Again, this is the 6th launch attempt for this mission. The first launch attempt was back on Tuesday, 5 days ago, September the 13th. And stormy weather kept the rocket on the ground throughout last week. And SpaceX called off yesterday's countdown before they started propellant loading. The Falcon 9 was actually lowered horizontal at Pad 40 early this morning for a few hours, perhaps for some inspections or some servicing, either of the launch vehicle or the ground support equipment. And then it was raised vertical mid-morning today in preparation for tonight's launch attempt. Now T-minus 23 minutes and 32 seconds. T-minus 21 minutes and 20 seconds. In the next few moments, we expect to hear the call from SpaceX's launch team, hopefully, that kerosene loading has been completed on the second stage. Again, kerosene and liquid oxygen are the propellants being loaded into the vehicle tonight, along with helium pressurant. And around the same time we hear the call of confirmation of kerosene loading completion on the second stage, we expect to see the so-called big vent from the strongback, and that will signal the start of chill down preparations for loading of liquid oxygen onto stage 2 of the Falcon 9 rocket. And there's the big vent. We didn't hear...
Stage 2 RP1 load complete.
Oh, we just heard Stage 2 RP1 load complete from Launch Control. So rocket-grade kerosene, known as Rocket Propellant 1 or RP1, is now fully loaded onto the second stage of the Falcon 9 rocket. And chill down of the liquid oxygen loading lines leading up the strongback into the second stage of the Falcon 9 rocket is now underway. This chill down thermally conditions those loading or transfer lines before the flow of oxidizer into the second stage begins in a few minutes. Now, T-minus 18 minutes and 20 seconds. Here's a look at some of the major events in tonight's countdown. We've already passed some of these milestones. At T-minus 35 minutes, SpaceX's launch team began loading propellants into the Falcon 9. And then at T-minus 20 minutes or so, we heard the call that the second stage had received its full load of kerosene fuel. The next step at T-minus 16 minutes will be the start of liquid oxygen loading onto stage 2. Again, the propellants of kerosene and liquid oxygen are densified on the Falcon 9 rocket, meaning they are chilled down colder than they would normally be for use on other rockets, closer to their freezing point. This allows SpaceX to essentially pack or cram more molecules of propellant into the Falcon 9 rocket. That gives the rocket a performance boost and ensures that the first stage booster has enough reserve propellant to perform its reentry burn and landing burn for recovery. At T-minus 7 minutes, the Falcon 9's Merlin 1D engines will begin their chill down procedure. This is the procedure that thermally conditions those Merlin 1D engines for startup. At T-minus 5.5 minutes or 6 minutes or so, in that ballpark, we expect to hear the call that the first stage has been fully loaded with kerosene fuel. At that point, the rocket will be fully fueled for launch. Oxidizer loading will continue, however. At T-minus 4.5 minutes, the strongback that you're seeing just to the right of the vehicle will recline back to an angle of about 1.5 to 1.8 degrees. That's where it will remain for the rest of the countdown before reclining back to an angle of about 45 degrees at liftoff. At T-minus 2 minutes, we expect to hear the call that the liquid oxygen loading on both stages has been completed. At that point, The Falcon 9 will weigh about 1.2 million pounds and will be fully loaded with propellant for liftoff
Start
this
of
evening.
stage 2 LOX load.
We just heard from launch control that the stage 2 liquid oxygen load is now underway. So that's that T-minus 16-minute milestone. At T-minus 60 seconds, the Falcon 9's onboard computer will take command of the countdown. At that point, the Falcon 9's onboard computer will be in command of the countdown, monitoring all the critical systems for the rest of the count down to T0. At T-minus 45 seconds, we expect to hear the call from SpaceX's launch director that they are go for launch. And then at T-minus 3 minutes, the Falcon 9's computer will send the command to the engine controller to ignite the 9 Merlin 1D engines. They'll go through an automated quick health check that'll last a couple of seconds. If everything checks out, the command will be given to release hold-down clamps, allowing the Falcon 9 to begin its vertical climb off the pad tonight at 8:18 p.m. Eastern Time. That's 12:18 UTC. Now inside of 15 minutes until tonight's launch, which will mark the 42nd flight of a Falcon 9 rocket this year, the 176th Falcon 9 launch overall. And this will be the 61st Falcon 9 launch that's been primarily dedicated to carrying satellites for the Starlink internet network. T-minus 12 minutes, 45 seconds. Here's a view of tonight's expected ground track. This red line shows the path the Falcon 9 will take on its climb into space tonight. It'll head downrange to the northeast from Cape Canaveral Space Force Station. We've labeled here the locations of Space Launch Complex 40, the launch pad, as well as the drone ship named Just Read the Instructions, which is positioned about 400 miles or 650 kilometers northeast of the Cape. That's roughly due east of Charleston, South Carolina. That's the position of the drone ship for tonight's mission. So as you can see, the Falcon 9 will head on a path that parallels the east coast of the United States. It'll be passing east of the Outer Banks of North Carolina. It'll also be passing east of New Jersey, east of New York City, off the coast of Cape Cod, and then off the coast of the Canadian Maritime Provinces. Those of you who may be living along the East Coast, if you have clear skies, you may be able to catch a glimpse of the Falcon 9 as it heads to space this evening. Liftoff now less than 12 minutes away. The Falcon 9's upper stage is set to deploy the 54 Starlink satellites about 15 minutes and 21 seconds into the flight. while the vehicle is flying over the middle of the North Atlantic Ocean between Newfoundland and Ireland. SpaceX's countdown just passed T-minus 10 minutes. Again, liftoff is targeted for 8:18 and 40 seconds p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. That is 12:18 a.m. 40 seconds UTC. If you're just joining us, you're watching live views of Space Launch Complex 40 at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station. I'm Stephen Clark reporting live from Kennedy Space Center a few miles away from the pad tonight. If you haven't had a chance to do so yet, please hit the like button on our stream. It helps us gain a bigger audience and reach more viewers with our live coverage tonight. So please like our stream if you haven't already. You can also join our Spaceflight Now YouTube channel as a member. We have different membership levels available for you to choose from. And depending on which level you select, you can gain access to exclusive video features. So bonus video coverage is available to our Spaceflight Now members who help us sustain our coverage of the launch schedule and launch activity here at Kennedy Space Center and Cape Canaveral Space Force Station. You can also contribute in our chat, in the super chat, using the super chat function rather. So any contribution you can provide there really helps us continue and expand our coverage. T-minus 8 minutes and 15 seconds. Here's a view of the flight history for this booster. This is booster number 1067 in SpaceX's inventory of reusable first stage boosters. It's flown 5 times before. It debuted back on June the 3rd, 2021 with a space station resupply mission using a Dragon spacecraft. It launched again last November with a team of 4 astronauts heading to the International Space Station on a Crew Dragon capsule. It launched last December with the Turksat 5B geostationary communications satellite. And then it flew again on April the 27th of this year with another crew mission heading up to the ISS. And most recently, it launched on July the 14th of this year with the CRS-25 cargo mission to the ISS. This booster going for flight number 6 tonight. Now inside of 7 minutes till launch.
Engine chill.
We've heard the call now from SpaceX Launch Control of engine chill. This is the start of the chill down of the 9 Merlin 1D or M1D engines that power the Falcon 9's first stage. This involves flowing a little bit of liquid oxygen through some of the plumbing into the engine compartment, into the engines themselves, to thermally condition those engines for startup. The oxidizer used by the Falcon 9 is chilled several hundred degrees below zero, so this chill down flows some of that oxidizer through the engines to get those engines down to the proper cold temperature to safely receive the full flow of liquid oxygen during the ignition sequence and the flight.
Stage 1 fuel load complete.
We've heard now the call of Stage 1 fuel load complete as the countdown nears T-minus 6 minutes. So the Falcon 9 has been fully loaded with 46,000 gallons of RP1. This rocket propellant 1. It's a highly refined kerosene fuel. Liquid oxygen continues flowing into the vehicle for another few minutes. That will be terminated at about T-minus 2 minutes or so. T-minus 5 minutes, 10 seconds. The next major event will be the retraction of the strongback at the pad.
Falcon tanks are pressing for strongback retract.
Strongback retract has started.
T-minus 4 minutes. We've heard the call that the strongback retract has started. That's the structure next to the Falcon 9 out at pad 40, moving to an angle of about 1.5 degrees from the vehicle. Now approaching T-minus 3 minutes. Strongback has indeed retracted to an angle of about 1.5 degrees from the Falcon 9 rocket. The next
Stage 1 LOX load complete.
Callouts we should hear will be liquid oxygen loading complete. We heard the Stage 1 liquid oxygen load has just completed. Stage 2 should be declared full momentarily. T-minus 2 minutes and 20 seconds. Now inside of 2 minutes until liftoff. Again, this is a Falcon 9 rocket awaiting launch from Cape Canaveral Space Force Station with 54 Starlink Internet satellites.
Stage 2 LOX load complete.
And we just heard the call of Stage 2 LOX load complete, so the Falcon 9 has been fully loaded with about 1 million pounds of propellants this evening. Everything remains go for launch at 8:18 p.m. and 40 seconds Eastern Time.
Ground closeouts has started.
T-minus 60 seconds.
Falcon 9 is in startup.
We've heard the call that Falcon 9 is in startup. The onboard computer on the rocket now in command of the countdown. T-minus 10 seconds. T-minus 5. There's engine start. And liftoff of SpaceX's Falcon 9 rocket from Cape Canaveral Space Force Station, hauling 50 more Starlink internet satellites into orbit. Falcon 9 heading downrange now to the northeast. We're hearing the rumble of those 9 Merlin 1D engines producing 1.7 million pounds of thrust now. Falcon 9 climbing into mostly clear skies tonight. Now passing T plus 90 seconds. I hope you enjoyed that rumble from the 9 Merlin engines, generating 1.7 million pounds of thrust. Falcon 9 has climbed above a thin cloud layer over the Space Coast. Now about 30 seconds, 35 seconds or so until main engine cutoff. That's when the 9 Merlin engines will shut down on the first stage. A few seconds later, we should see stage separation. And then we should see ignition of the Merlin vacuum engine on the second stage. We'll stand by for those milestones in the next 15 to 20 seconds. We have main engine cutoff. It looks like we have ignition also of the second stage. Merlin vacuum engine now producing about 200,000 pounds of thrust. This is a 6-minute burn to inject the 54 Starlink satellites into their preliminary transfer orbit. Passing 3 minutes into the flight now. We're now switching to SpaceX's stream of the launch. So you're seeing onboard views from the first stage booster on the left-hand side of your screen. And on the right, you're seeing the Merlin vacuum engine doing its work. That nozzle glowing red hot, that is normal, producing, again, about 200,000 pounds of thrust. The first stage is heading toward landing on the drone ship. Just read the instructions about 400 miles northeast of the Cape tonight. You can see the 4 hypersonic grid fins have extended, and you're seeing periodic pulses from coal gas thrusters. Those thrusters using nitrogen gas to reorient the booster into the proper orientation or attitude for reentry back into the atmosphere. Everything looking good. 4 minutes, approaching 4 minutes into the flight. Now mark T plus 4 minutes. The Falcon 9 now at an altitude, the booster at an altitude of 130 kilometers, the second stage passing 145 kilometers now.
Acquisition of signal, Bermuda.
We're hearing call-outs now that the downrange tracking station in Bermuda is receiving signals from the upper stage as it heads northeast up the eastern seaboard of the United States.
Both vehicles are following nominal trajectories.
Now approaching 6 minutes into the flight. The next major milestone will be the entry burn of the first stage booster. That should begin in less than 40 seconds now. That will be a relight of 3 of the Merlin engines on the first stage. You'll see that hopefully if the onboard camera from the Falcon 9 booster remains steady. We hope to see that ignition of the 3 Merlin engines for the entry burn in about 20 to 30 seconds.
Stage 1 entry burn startup.
SpaceX confirms the
Stage
startup
1 FTS
of the
is
entry
safe.
burn. 3 Merlin engines have lit to slow the rocket down for its re-entry back into the atmosphere. You can see that velocity meter on the lower left rapidly decreasing with this retrograde burn.
Stage 1 entry burn shutdown.
And there's entry burn shutdown. The next burn will be a single engine burn, the landing burn, using the center engine for the final braking before touchdown on the drone ship.
Stage 2 FTS has safed.
Stage 1 transonic.
Stage 1 now passing below the speed of sound, heading for the landing on the drone ship. Just read the instructions. This is completing the 6th flight to space
Thermal
for this
guidance.
booster. Booster 1067 now on the final phase of its descent. You're seeing live views from Stage 2 of the Falcon 9 with the Merlin vacuum engine firing to inject these 54 Starlink satellites into orbit.
Stage 1 landing burn.
Stage 1 landing burn underway. You can see that on the left side of your screen. Coming through some clouds now, heading for the deck of Just Read the Instructions.
Stage 1 landing leg deploy.
Seco.
Stage 1 landing confirmed.
And there's a successful landing. Booster 1067 has arrived on the deck of the drone ship Just Read the
Nominal orbit
Instructions,
insertion.
completing the 6th flight to space for this Falcon 9 first stage.
Expected loss of signal. Cape.
We also have heard that the upper stage has arrived in orbit now with the 54 Starlink internet satellites after the Merlin vacuum engine completed its orbit insertion burn. And the last call we heard that the
Acquisition
Falcon
of signal
9's
to Finland.
upper stage has passed over the horizon here at Cape Canaveral. The ground tracking station here at the launch site has lost the signal from the vehicle as expected, but a downrange tracking station in Newfoundland is now receiving telemetry from the rocket. Great view now of the first stage on the deck of the drone ship. SpaceX is ending their webcast right now, but we're going to stay live for a few more minutes to track this final step in the launch tonight, which is the deployment of the 54 Starlink satellites at T+15 minutes and 21 seconds. That's about 5 minutes or so away. We're going to continue to show this map showing the track of the Falcon 9 upper stage in orbit. Should be deploying the satellites as it is over the North Atlantic Ocean between Newfoundland and Ireland. Tonight's mission is was targeting an orbit with a perigee of 144 miles and apogee of 208 miles. That's 232 by 336 kilometers. And the Falcon 9 appears to have hit those marks tonight with a nominal orbit insertion. Again, the orbit is inclined 53.2 degrees to the equator. This mission, known as Starlink 4-34, targeting shell number 4 in the Starlink network, which actually has 5 different layers to it, with satellites flying at different altitudes and at different inclinations. Right now, SpaceX is primarily launching into shell number 4 to fill out this network.
Expected loss of signal. Bermuda.
T+13 minutes. While we wait for confirmation of Starlink deployment, we invite you once again to please become a member of our YouTube channel. We have different memberships available for you to choose from, and depending on which level you choose, you can gain access to exclusive video features. We have bonus video available for our YouTube members. Also, if you haven't done so yet, you can subscribe to our YouTube channel. So just hit the subscribe button if you haven't done so, and you will get alerts as we're going live for launches here at Cape Canaveral. Your support through our memberships on YouTube and through the super chats here in our chat on YouTube help us continue our streaming video coverage. It also helps us maintain our coverage that we've offered now for 22 years, going on 23 years, on spaceflightnow.com of the wider space industry. So we appreciate your support in those areas. Now less than 40 seconds away from the expected time of Starlink separation. The Falcon 9's upper stage should now be spinning up into an orientation for deployment of the 54 Starlink satellites. When the command is given to deploy the satellites, 4 retention rods will be jettisoned from the upper stage, and that will allow the stack of Starlink satellites to fly free of the Falcon 9. That milestone should be coming momentarily.
Hello, deploy confirmed.
And there's confirmation of Starlink separation. 54 more Starlink internet satellites have arrived in orbit after tonight's launch from Cape Canaveral Space Force Station.
Acquisition of signal. Good Hilly.
We're now streaming a view of the now empty Space Launch Complex 40 pad, where the Falcon 9 took off 17 minutes ago. To recap, we saw a liftoff of the Falcon 9 rocket from pad 40 at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station at 8:18 p.m. Eastern Time, or 12:18 a.m. UTC. This launch occurred after 5 days of delays, weather delays here on Florida Space Coast. It's been a persistently wet month of September with a lot of thunderstorm activity and showers in the area. Those prevented the Falcon 9 from taking off throughout last week. But today the weather cooperated. Going into tonight, the weather forecast called for just a 40% chance of acceptable conditions, but throughout the countdown, that weather picture improved. And at liftoff, there were mostly clear skies overhead, just a few scattered high-level clouds, no rain or thunderstorms in the area to allow SpaceX's Falcon 9 rocket to get off the ground. This completed the 42nd SpaceX launch of the year. Before we sign off, we want to run through some of the mission stats for tonight's flight. This was the 176th launch of a Falcon 9 rocket since 2010. It was the 184th launch overall for SpaceX's Falcon rocket family. This includes Falcon 9s, Falcon Heavy rocket, as well as the now retired Falcon 1 vehicle. This was the 6th flight for this particular booster, Booster 1067. We saw that land on the drone ship about 8.5 minutes after liftoff, ready to come back to port and refurbishment here at Cape Canaveral for a 7th launch in the not-too-distant future. This was the 151st Falcon 9 launch from Florida's Space Coast. It was the 97th Falcon 9 launch from Space Launch Complex 40 at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station, and the 152nd launch overall from this pad, which had its first launch back in 1965 with the Air Force's Titan rocket program. And again, the Titan rocket was retired in 2005, and this pad was handed over to SpaceX, which has a long-term lease for this facility from the U.S. Space Force. So the 97th SpaceX launch from this pad, the 152nd launch overall from this launch facility. It's the 118th flight of a Falcon 9 rocket powered by a reused first stage. Also was the 142nd successful landing of a Falcon booster. This was the 61st SpaceX launch primarily dedicated to the Starlink network, the 42nd SpaceX launch of the year, and the 40th orbital launch attempt from Cape Canaveral Space Force Station or Kennedy Space Center so far in 2022. This includes missions by SpaceX primarily, along with the United Launch Alliance, and 2 launch attempts from Astra, which did not reach orbit, but they're counted in our statistics because they were space launch attempts. Now, 24 minutes, 40 seconds since tonight's launch of a Falcon 9 rocket. You're looking live at Pad 40, where the Falcon 9 departed at 8:18 p.m. Eastern Time and placed 54 more Starlink Internet satellites into orbit. We heard the confirmation of that payload deployment milestone a little less than 10 minutes ago. Before we leave you tonight, we invite you to go to our Spaceflight Now store. Please go to shop.spaceflightnow.com. There you'll find a selection of memorabilia and mission patches for NASA and SpaceX missions. One of our newest arrivals is the mission patch for Crew 5. This is the next crew launch heading to the International Space Station from Kennedy Space Center. This will carry a team of 4 to the space station, commanded by NASA astronaut Nicole Mann. She'll be joined by 3 crewmates, 1 American, 1 Japanese astronaut, and 1 Russian cosmonaut. So a team of 4 astronauts and cosmonauts heading to the International Space Station no earlier than October the 3rd from Kennedy Space Center on a SpaceX Crew Dragon spacecraft. The Crew 5 mission patch is available for purchase on our Spaceflight Now store at shop.spaceflightnow.com. And looking ahead at our next launches on our calendar, coming up this week, we have a few launches scheduled. First of all, on Wednesday, September 21st, we have the scheduled launch of a Russian Soyuz rocket. This will be carrying the next crew to the space station, launching a few weeks before the Crew 5 mission. This is the Soyuz MS-22 mission with 2 Russian cosmonauts and 1 U.S. astronaut. This will be the first launch of a mixed crew, Russian and American crew, on a Soyuz spacecraft since NASA and the Russian Space Agency Roscosmos finalized a barter, seat sharing, or seat swap agreement earlier this summer. And this agreement enables Russian spacecraft to continue flying U.S. astronauts to the ISS, and SpaceX's Crew Dragon to fly Russian cosmonauts to and from the space station. This ensures there's always an American astronaut and at least 1 Russian cosmonaut on the space station, even if there is a problem or major delay with the SpaceX Dragon and Falcon 9 or the Russian Soyuz. So the space station is not limited to 1 crew transportation vehicle. Crews can launch on Soyuz and Crew Dragon. This launch is scheduled from the Baikonur Cosmodrome in Kazakhstan from Site 31 on September 21st. That's Wednesday. Launch is scheduled for 13:54 UTC. That's 9:54 a.m. Eastern Time. Coming up next Saturday, September 24th, United Launch Alliance is preparing for liftoff of a Delta IV Heavy rocket with a classified payload for the National Reconnaissance Office. This is the U.S. government's spy satellite agency. This mission is set to launch from Space Launch Complex 6, known as Slick 6 at Vandenberg Space Force Base. This will be the 3rd to last launch of a Delta IV Heavy rocket, which ULA is retiring, and the final Delta launch ever from Vandenberg Space Force Base after a storied history that dates back to the 1960s. The final Delta flight from Vandenberg Space Force Base is set for next Saturday, September the 24th, with a classified payload for the NRO. Looking later in September, SpaceX's next launch is likely scheduled for about a week away. We haven't had a confirmed date for that. That was scheduled for Tuesday, the 19th of September, but that launch was delayed as a ripple effect from the delays of this launch tonight, which is running 5 days behind schedule. And we expect the next Falcon 9 launch from Pad 40 to occur in the last week of September sometime. We haven't got a confirmed date yet, but that will carry the next batch of Starlink satellites to orbit. And then the launch no earlier than September the 27th of the NASA Artemis 1 lunar test flight. We're also tracking that. Coming up on Wednesday, NASA is scheduled to perform a tanking test for the Space Launch System moon rocket out on Pad 39B. Here you're seeing a live view of the Artemis 1 vehicle on Pad 39B right now at Kennedy Space Center. NASA's launch team is preparing to load liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen into the vehicle on Wednesday. This is a tanking test before the scheduled launch of the Artemis 1 mission no earlier than September the 27th. This tanking test on Wednesday will verify that ground crews in recent days have fixed a hydrogen leak that caused a scrub for a launch attempt for Artemis 1 earlier this month. And NASA is still awaiting final decision from the Space Force Eastern Range on whether they're going to extend the certification of battery life on the flight termination system on the Space Launch System moon rocket. This is the range safety destruct system that would destroy the rocket if it veered off course after liftoff. That certification has expired, and in order for the launch to go ahead later this month, the Space Force range safety team will have to formally extend that certification to allow the launch to proceed. But NASA is gearing up just in case that certification is extended for the launch of the Artemis 1 later this month. Liftoff, again, is scheduled no earlier than September the 21st if that certification is extended and if the tanking test on Wednesday goes well and proves that there is no hydrogen leak on the system. The alternative is for NASA to have to potentially roll the vehicle back to the hangar, the vehicle assembly building at KSC, for further repairs to the hydrogen leak if necessary, and also rechecks of the flight termination system to extend that certification. So a lot of uncertainty remaining in the schedule for the Artemis 1 launch. The big ones are the outcome of this tanking test coming up Wednesday, which we'll be covering live here on Spaceflight Now's YouTube channel and on spaceflightnow.com, as well as the pending potential extension of the range safety batteries. We'll leave you with one last look at Space Launch Complex 40. To recap once more, SpaceX launched the Starlink 4-34 mission tonight after 5 days of delays at 8:18 p.m. Eastern Time or 12:18 a.m. UTC. This was the 40th space launch from Cape Canaveral or Kennedy Space Center this year, the 42nd launch overall by SpaceX this year, including missions from here in Florida and from California. The 176th launch of a Falcon 9 rocket, and the 61st SpaceX launch primarily dedicated to deploying satellites for the Starlink Internet Network. 54 more Starlink satellites now safely in orbit following tonight's launch. We're going to sign off from our coverage now. We hope you've enjoyed the show. We hope you've enjoyed the launch. We'll be with you later this week for the Artemis 1 tanking test, and we'll be with you on spaceflightnow.com later this week for the launch of the next crew to the ISS from the Baikonur Cosmodrome, and for the launch of ULA's Delta IV Heavy rocket from Vandenberg Space Force Base. Busy times ahead. Until next time, I'm Stephen Clark from NASA's Kennedy Space Center in Florida. Have a great night.